Ana Clara lived alone in a small, quiet town, having lost her parents at a young age. At 18, she had already learned to navigate life with a sense of independence and resilience that belied her age. Her dream of becoming a doctor kept her focused, and she was known for her kindness and dedication. Yet, beneath her strong exterior, there was a longing for connection, for someone who could share her dreams and understand her heart. One evening, Anna was invited to a birthday party by a friend she hadn't seen in a while. It was a rare opportunity for her to relax, to step away from the books and the solitary life she led. The party was held at a small, cozy venue in town, filled with laughter and music, a stark contrast to the quiet nights she was used to. It was there that she met Carlos. He was older, perhaps by a decade or more, with a charming smile that seemed to light up the room. He approached her with a confidence that was both disarming and flattering. They talked, and Anna found herself drawn to his charisma. Carlos was attentive, listening to her dreams of studying medicine, and he spoke with a smoothness that made her feel seen, as if she was the only person in the room. As the evening progressed, Carlos's interest in Anna grew more apparent. He offered to walk her home, and she agreed, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. During the walk, he asked her questions about her life, her ambitions, and her past. Anna, usually reserved, found herself opening up to him, sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years. The next few weeks were filled with messages from Carlos, small gestures that made Anna feel special. He would send her flowers, leave notes at her doorstep, and call just to hear her voice. It was all so new to her, and she began to feel that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who could fill the void in her life. Moving in with Carlos seemed like the right decision at the time. Anna, having lost her mother, was alone in the world, and Carlos had offered her a sense of security, a place where she could belong. But as the days turned into weeks, the man who had once seemed so caring began to change. It started with small comments, almost unnoticeable at first. Carlos would criticize the way Anna dressed, suggesting she was too plain, too modest. "You could look so much better if you just put in a little more effort," he'd say, his tone laced with a mixture of disdain and impatience. Anna, eager to please, took his words to heart, trying to adjust, but the criticisms kept coming. Carlos began to distance Anna from her friends, those few who still tried to keep in touch. He'd make excuses when they called, saying she was busy or not feeling well. When Anna protested, he'd dismiss her concerns with a wave of his hand. "They don't really care about you, Anna. If they did, they wouldn't need to call so often." The isolation grew, and soon it wasn't just her friends. Carlos would speak poorly of her late mother, a topic that was once off-limits. "She didn't prepare you for the real world, did she? That's why you're so naive, so trusting. You need me to protect you, Anna. No one else will." His words cut deep, and Anna found herself shrinking in his presence, her confidence eroding under his relentless criticism. The man who had once made her feel special now seemed determined to make her feel small, insignificant. Then came the first instance of violence. It was late, and Anna had been out shopping for groceries. She returned to find Carlos waiting, his face dark with anger. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice dangerous. "At the store," Anna replied, startled by his tone. "I told you I was going—" "You're lying," he snapped, cutting her off. "I called the store. They said you left an hour ago." "Who were you with, Anna? What are you hiding from me?" Before she could answer, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. Anna winced, trying to pull away, but Carlos held firm, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "You're mine, Anna, don't you ever forget that." He released her suddenly, as if her skin had burned him, and she stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The shock of what had just happened left her speechless, and Carlos, seeing the fear in her eyes, seemed to relish it. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and walked away as if nothing had happened. Anna was left standing there, her arm throbbing where his fingers had dug into her flesh. The pain was sharp, but the fear that spread through her was even sharper. She realized then that the man she had moved in with was not the man she had fallen in love with. He was someone else entirely, someone she didn't know, someone she feared. The violence didn't stop there. In the days that followed, Carlos's temper flared more frequently. He'd lash out at the smallest things, a dish left unwashed, a comment that didn't please him. Each time Anna would try to calm him, to diffuse the situation, but it was like walking on eggshells. She never knew what might set him off, and with each outburst, her fear grew. She thought about leaving, about packing her things and disappearing, but the thought of what Carlos might do if he found her kept her rooted to the spot. She was trapped, caught between her fear of him and the remnants of the love she once felt. The realization that she had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, settled like a heavy weight in her chest. Carlos had isolated her so completely that she was utterly alone, and that isolation, more than anything, terrified her. Ana Clara stood in the dimly lit bathroom, her hands trembling as she stared at the small plastic stick in her hand. 2 lines. Her breath caught in her throat, a mixture of shock and disbelief swirling in her chest. Pregnant. The word felt foreign, almost surreal. For a brief moment, a flicker of joy warmed her heart, a tiny life growing inside her, a new beginning. But the warmth was quickly extinguished by a cold wave of fear. Carlos. The name echoed in her mind like a death knell, bringing with it the full weight of reality. How would he react? Her stomach tightened at the thought, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The Carlos she once knew, the man who had showered her with affection and promises, had long since been replaced by someone she barely recognized. Someone who could be cruel, unpredictable, and terrifying. She sank to the floor, the pregnancy test slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the tiles. The room seemed to close in around her as she struggled to breathe. How could she bring a child into this world, into this life of fear and uncertainty? But how could she not? The thought of terminating the pregnancy was unbearable, yet the idea of telling Carlos filled her with dread. She knew she couldn't hide it from him for long. The changes in her body would soon become obvious, and Carlos was nothing if not observant. But telling him now, while the life inside her was still so fragile, felt like a gamble she couldn't afford to lose. She had seen his anger, felt the sting of his words and the force of his hands. And this was something that would push him over the edge. Anna didn't know how long she sat there, curled up on the cold bathroom floor, her mind racing in circles. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff and her head was throbbing. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, startled by the pale, drawn face staring back at her. She looked like a ghost of herself, haunted by the life she was now trapped in. That evening, as she prepared dinner, her hands moved automatically, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, while her mind was consumed with what lay ahead. Carlos would be home soon, and she knew she couldn't delay the inevitable. The words seemed stuck in her throat, as if saying them out loud would make everything more real, more terrifying. Carlos arrived, his usual scowl deepening as he entered the small apartment. "What's for dinner?" he barked, barely glancing at her as he shrugged off his coat. "Just soup," Anna replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart pounded in her chest, the moment of truth drawing ever closer. She set the table with trembling hands, trying to muster the courage to speak. They sat down, the silence between them heavy and oppressive. Carlos slurped his soup, his eyes fixed on the television, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside Anna. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, the words refusing to come. Finally, she couldn't take it any more. "Carlos," she began, her voice shaky, I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, his expression impatient. "What now?" I'm pregnant." The words came out in a rush, and for a moment she felt a strange sense of relief. It was done. There was no turning back now. Carlos stared at her, his spoon hovering in mid-air. The color drained from his face, replaced by a dark, simmering anger. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Anna felt her stomach twist in fear, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm pregnant, Carlos. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, Carlos threw his spoon across the room, the metal clattering loudly against the wall. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted, rising from his chair so quickly that it toppled over. "You can't keep it! You're not keeping that thing!" Anna flinched at his words, tears welling up in her eyes. "Carlos, please, me!" he roared, advancing toward her with a look of pure fury. "You're getting rid of it, do you hear me? There's no way I'm letting you ruin my life with a kid." She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, Carlos. I can't. I won't." But her words were drowned out by his rage, his threats echoing in her ears. That night, as she lay awake in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, Anna knew she had to leave. There was no other option. She had to protect her child, even if it meant giving up everything she knew. The decision weighed heavily on her, but it was the only choice she could make. The life growing inside her was her only hope, her only light in the darkness that had consumed her world, and she would do whatever it took to keep that light alive. The night was thick with shadows as Anna Clara slipped out of the small apartment she once called home. The moonlight barely touched the narrow alleyways, and every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear driving her forward as she clutched a small bag of hastily gathered belongings. She didn't look back. There was nothing to return to. The first night on the streets was a blur of fear and confusion. Anna wandered aimlessly, the cold seeping into her bones. She finally found a narrow doorway to curl up in, pulling her coat tightly around her. Sleep was impossible. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of cars, the occasional shout, kept her on edge. But more than that, it was the knowledge that she was truly alone, with nothing but the growing life inside her to keep her company. Days turned into nights, and the struggle to survive became her new reality. Finding food was a daily battle, a challenge that required both luck and perseverance. Anna learned quickly which places were safe to scavenge, which dumpsters were likely to hold something edible. On a good day, she might find a stale sandwich or a bruised apple, small victories that kept her going. Shelter was harder to come by. The city's doorways and alleyways offered little protection from the elements. Rain soaked her to the skin, and the cold was a constant companion, gnawing at her resolve. But she pressed on, knowing she had no other choice. Every step she took was for her unborn child, the one thing that gave her strength in this desolate existence. It was on one such cold, damp evening that she met Mrs. Heen Anderson. Anna had been sitting on a bench in a small park, her thin coat pulled tightly around her. The ache in her stomach had become a familiar pain, dulled only by exhaustion. She hadn't noticed the older woman until she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Dear, are you all right?" the woman asked, her voice soft and filled with concern. Anna looked up, startled. Mrs. Anderson was a petite woman, her hair silver and neatly pinned back. She wore a thick wool coat and carried a small shopping bag. There was kindness in her eyes, something Anna hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime. "I'm fine," Anna lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Anderson didn't press further. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a wrapped sandwich. "Here, take this. You look like you could use a good meal." Tears welled up in Anna's eyes as she took the sandwich, the simple act of kindness overwhelming her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. The woman smiled gently. "It's no trouble at all. I come here often. You're welcome to join me whenever you need." From that night on, Mrs. Anderson became a regular presence in Anna's life. They would sit together on the park bench, talking quietly as the world passed by around them. The older woman never pried into Anna's past, never asked questions that might cause pain. Instead, she offered food, warmth, and the kind of companionship that Anna had forgotten existed. As the days turned into weeks, Anna found a small glimmer of hope amidst the bleakness. Mrs. Anderson's kindness, though simple, was a lifeline. It reminded her that there was still good in the world, that she was not entirely alone. Each time Mrs. Anderson handed her a sandwich or a warm cup of tea, Anna felt a little of the weight on her shoulders lift. She could endure the cold, the hunger, the fear for her child, and for the small acts of kindness that kept her going. With every step, every struggle, she held onto the belief that somehow she would survive this. The life growing inside her gave her a purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. Anna Clara stumbled through the darkened alley, her breaths coming in ragged gasps as waves of pain tore through her body. The contractions had started hours ago, each one more intense than the last, until she could barely stand. She clutched her swollen belly, panic rising in her chest as she realized the baby was coming. Now. She had no one to turn to. The streets had become her world, and in that world there was no room for a woman in labor, no place to find comfort or safety. She had tried to reach the park where she often met Mrs. Anderson, but the pain had driven her off course, and now she was alone, lost in a maze of unfamiliar streets. The alley was desolate, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. Anna sank to her knees, her body trembling with the effort of holding on. Tears of desperation filled her eyes. She couldn't do this, not here, not like this. But there was no choice. The baby was coming, and she had to be strong for her child. As she fought to stay conscious, she heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind her. Turning her head with what little strength she had left, she saw the familiar figure of Mrs. Anderson hurrying toward her, a look of deep concern etched on her face. "Anna, dear, I've been looking for you," Mrs. Anderson said, kneeling beside her. "I knew something was wrong when you didn't come to the park today." I can't," Anna gasped, clutching Mrs. Anderson's hand as another contraction ripped through her. "Hush now," Mrs. Anderson soothed, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "I'm here. We're going to get through this together." Mrs. Anderson quickly assessed the situation, her years of life experience guiding her as she took charge. She found an old discarded blanket nearby and spread it out on the ground, helping Anna lie down as gently as possible. Anna's world narrowed to the pain, the overwhelming fear, and the steady, reassuring presence of Mrs. Anderson by her side. The labor was agonizing, each contraction leaving Anna weaker, her cries echoing off the walls of the narrow alley. But through it all, Mrs. Anderson remained a rock, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, guiding her through the waves of pain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Anna felt a release, a final push, and then the sound of a baby's cry pierced the cold night air. The sound was like a beacon in the darkness, pulling Anna back from the brink of exhaustion. "It's a girl," Mrs. Anderson said softly, wrapping the newborn in the blanket and placing her in Anna's trembling arms. The tiny baby's cries softened as she felt the warmth of her mother's body, and Anna stared down at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. But as she looked into the innocent, unknowing eyes of her child, the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She had nothing, no home, no money, no way to provide for this fragile life she had brought into the world. The weight of that realization was crushing. I can't keep her," Anna whispered, her voice breaking. "I have nothing to give her. Nothing." Mrs. Anderson's eyes filled with sadness, understanding the unspoken decision. "Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we make out of love," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from Anna's tear-streaked face. With a heart heavy with sorrow, Anna knew what she had to do. She looked around the alley, spotting a small piece of broken glass. Carefully, she took it in her hand and etched a tiny mark on the back of her daughter's shoulder, a symbol, a promise, that one day she would find her again. Mrs. Anderson helped Anna to her feet, and together they walked through the quiet streets until they reached the hospital. The bright lights of the entrance were a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded them. With trembling hands, Anna placed her sleeping daughter on the steps, her heart breaking with each step she took away from the child she had just brought into the world. Before turning to leave, Anna knelt down and kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering a tearful goodbye. "I love you so much," she choked out, the words heavy with the pain of separation. "I'll find you again, I promise." Then, with Mrs. Anderson's arm around her, Anna walked away, her body weak, her soul shattered. The early morning light filtered through the windows of the hospital, casting a soft glow over the pristine floors. The night shift nurses were just about to finish their rounds when they found her, an infant, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, placed gently on the steps outside. The baby's cries were faint but insistent, a desperate plea for attention. Maria, the head nurse, was the first to reach the tiny bundle. She carefully lifted the baby into her arms, her heart swelling with both pity and concern. The child was small, fragile, but there was a quiet strength in the way she clung to life. "We've got to get her inside," Maria said, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. As the nurses worked quickly to assess the baby's condition, it became clear that she had been abandoned only hours after birth. The child was healthy, but cold and hungry. They cleaned her, wrapped her in a warm blanket, and finally, as the chaos subsided, the baby fell into a peaceful sleep in Maria's arms. It was during the routine examination that they discovered the mark, a tiny, deliberate etching on the back of her shoulder. The nurses exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to make of it. It wasn't a birthmark, but rather a symbol, etched with careful precision. Maria frowned, gently tracing the mark with her finger. "What kind of mother would leave this behind?" she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Over the next few days, the hospital staff became captivated by the mysterious baby. They named her Sophia, a name that seemed to suit the quiet strength she displayed even as a newborn. But the mark on her back remained a mystery, a question that lingered in the minds of those who cared for her. Sophia's story took a hopeful turn when a kind couple, Marta and Joanne, came forward to adopt her. They had been waiting for a child for years, and from the moment they laid eyes on Sophia, they knew she was meant to be theirs. The adoption process was swift, and soon Sophia was taken to her new home, a place filled with warmth, love, and security. Growing up, Sophia wanted for nothing. Marta and Johann showered her with love, encouraging her curiosity, nurturing her every interest. She thrived in their care, becoming a bright, inquisitive child who loved books and puzzles. But despite the happiness that surrounded her, there was always a small, unspoken void in her life. It started as a quiet awareness, a feeling that something was missing. Marta and Johann never hid the fact that Sophia was adopted, and they answered her questions as best they could. But when it came to her origins, the story was vague, the details blurry. All they had to offer was the story of how she was found, abandoned on the hospital steps, marked with a symbol that no one could explain. As Sophia grew older, the mark on her back became a source of fascination. She would often stand in front of the mirror, craning her neck to catch a glimpse of it, her fingers tracing the outline as she wondered what it meant. The more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Who had left it there? And why? By the time Sophia turned 15, the curiosity had grown into something more, a deep, burning need to know the truth. She began to ask more questions, pressing Marta and Johann for every detail they could remember. It was during one of these conversations that Marta hesitantly handed her a small envelope. Inside was a document from the hospital, a record of her first hours there. And there, in neat typed letters, was a brief note about the mark on her back. Sophia's heart raced as she read the words, the significance of the mark suddenly taking on a new weight. This was more than just a curious detail. It was a link to her past, a clue that could lead her to the answers she had always sought. That night, as Sophia lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the document. The questions she had always pushed to the back of her mind now surged to the forefront. Who was her mother? Why had she been abandoned? And most importantly, what did the mark on her back mean? The next morning, Sophia made a decision. She was going to find out the truth, no matter how long it took, no matter what she had to do. The journey to uncover her past had begun, and there was no turning back. Sophia stood in the small, cluttered room that had become her sanctuary over the past few weeks. The desk was covered with papers, hospital documents, and scattered notes she'd meticulously compiled. Each piece was a fragment of a puzzle that, once complete, would reveal the truth about her past. The journey had been slow and frustrating, but with every passing day, Sophia's determination only grew stronger. The hospital document she had found on her 15th birthday had ignited something in her, a fire that refused to be extinguished. The mark on her back, once just a curious blemish, was now a symbol of everything she didn't know about herself. Who had left it there? And why? These questions haunted her, driving her to dig deeper, to uncover every detail she could about her origins. Her search had led her back to the area where she had been found, a place that held no memories for her, but where she hoped to find answers. The neighborhood had changed over the years, but some things remained the same. The hospital still stood at the corner of the street, its facade weathered but familiar. Sophia had spent days walking the streets, speaking to anyone who might remember something, a face, a name, a story. Most people had little to offer, vague recollections at best. But then, as she was about to lose hope, she met Mrs. Anderson. It was a cold, grey afternoon when Sophia first saw the elderly woman sitting on a park bench, her coat pulled tightly around her small frame. There was something about her that drew Sophia in, a sense that this woman, of all the people she had spoken to, might hold the key to her past. "Excuse me," Sophia said hesitantly, approaching the bench. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Mrs. Anderson?" The woman looked up, her sharp blue eyes scanning Sophia's face with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Yes, that's me. And you are?" "My name is Sophia," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest. "I was told you might know something about a woman named Anna Clara, my mom." Mrs. Anderson's expression softened at the mention of the name, and she nodded slowly. "Anna Clara. Yes, I remember her. It's been many years, but I haven't forgotten." Sophia felt a surge of hope. "Can you tell me about her? Anything you remember?" Mrs. Anderson gestured for Sophia to sit beside her. Anna was a strong woman, stronger than most. She was scared, of course. Who wouldn't be in her situation? But she never let that fear stop her. She was determined to protect her child, even if it meant giving up everything. Sophia listened intently as Mrs. Anderson recounted the story, how she had met Anna on a cold night in the streets, how she had helped her through the birth of her daughter, and how, in the end, they had both known that the best chance for the baby was to leave her at the hospital. "She loved you, Sophia," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice gentle but firm. "She loved you more than anything. Leaving you at that hospital was the hardest thing she ever did, but she believed it was the only way to keep you safe." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes as the weight of Mrs. Anderson's words sank in. She had always imagined her mother as a distant, unknowable figure, but now she could see her, could feel the depth of her love and the pain of her sacrifice. "After that night, we lost touch," Mrs. Anderson continued, her gaze distant as if reliving the memory. "Anna and I went our separate ways. I searched for her, but she was gone. It's a hard life, living on the streets. People disappear all the time." Sophia's heart ached at the thought of her mother, alone and vulnerable. But now she had a clearer picture of the woman who had given her life. It wasn't enough to just know. Sophia needed to find her, to tell her that she was safe, that her sacrifice had not been in vain. "I have to find her," Sophia said, her voice filled with resolve. "I have to know what happened to her." Mrs. Anderson reached out, squeezing Sophia's hand. "If anyone can find her, it's you. Just don't give up." Anna never did. With Mrs. Anderson's encouragement, Sophia's determination solidified into action. She spent the following months tirelessly searching for any trace of Anna Clara. She combed through old records, spoke to countless people, and followed every lead, no matter how small. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of dead ends, Sophia uncovered a concrete lead. News of a woman matching Anna Clara's description living in a nearby town. It was the breakthrough she had been waiting for, and though the path ahead was still uncertain, Sophia knew she was closer than ever to finding the truth. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was close, that the years of searching, the endless questions, and the countless dead ends were finally leading her to the answer she had been yearning for. After her conversation with Mrs. Anderson, she had thrown herself into the search with renewed determination. Every name, every location, every scrap of information was another piece of the puzzle that would bring her to her mother. The breakthrough came on a quiet morning. Sophia had been poring over old newspaper archives in the library, looking for any mention of women who matched Anna Clara's description. It was slow, painstaking work, but she was used to that by now. Her patience was rewarded when she stumbled across a small article about a woman named Anna who had recently started working at a bakery in a nearby town. The description was vague, but something about it resonated with Sophia. She knew she had to follow this lead. She approached her adoptive parents that evening, her voice calm but resolute. "I think I've found her," she said, the weight of the words hanging in the air. Marta and Johann exchanged a look, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and concern. They had seen Sophia through so many ups and downs during this search, and they knew how much it meant to her. "We'll go with you," Johann said finally, his voice steady. The drive to the town was long and silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Sophia's heart raced as they neared their destination, the town's name looming on the road signs. She could hardly believe that after all these years she might actually be about to see her mother again. When they arrived, Sophia felt a strange mix of emotions: anticipation, fear, and something she couldn't quite name. They walked down the narrow streets, the smell of fresh bread and pastries guiding them to the small bakery mentioned in the article. Sophia's steps slowed as they approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the glass she could see a woman behind the counter, her back turned as she busied herself with the morning's orders. The bell above the door chimed softly as they entered, and the woman turned around. Time seemed to freeze. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she looked at the woman who could only be Anna Clara. She was older, with lines etched into her face that spoke of a life hard-lived, but there was no mistaking the resemblance. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. Anna Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, a mix of confusion and suspicion crossing her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice guarded. Sophia felt her throat tighten, the words struggling to form. "Are you—" "Anna Clara," she managed, her voice trembling. Anna Clara's gaze sharpened, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes, though she seemed to push it aside. "Who's asking?" "It's me," Sophia said, stepping forward, her voice stronger now. "I'm Sophia, your daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Anna Clara stared at Sophia, her expression unreadable, as if she were seeing a ghost. Then, slowly, the realization began to dawn, and the guarded mask she wore started to crumble. "Sophia?" Anna Clara's voice was barely a whisper, her hand trembling as she reached out, as though afraid that this was all a dream that might slip away. Sophia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, it's me." The distance between them vanished in an instant as Anna Clara pulled Sophia into her arms, holding her as though she might disappear at any moment. Years of pain, separation, and longing poured out in that embrace, their tears mingling as they clung to each other, both overwhelmed by the emotions they had kept buried for so long. Marta and Johann stood quietly to the side, giving them the space they needed. There was nothing they could say that would add to this moment. It was theirs, alone. When they finally pulled apart, Anna Clara looked at Sophia with eyes full of wonder and disbelief. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you." Sophia smiled through her tears, taking her mother's hand in hers. "I've thought about you too, every single day. I've wanted so much to find you, to know you." They spent the rest of the day talking, sharing stories, and filling in the gaps of the years they had missed. Anna Clara's life had been hard, but she had survived, and hearing Sophia's story brought her both pain and pride. As the sun began to set, it became clear that their reunion was only the beginning. Anna Clara agreed to move in with Sophia and her adoptive parents, and they started the process of rebuilding their lives together. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, they both felt the stirrings of hope. The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon, its presence marked only by the sound of paper sliding through the mail slot and landing with a soft rustle on the floor. Sophia, caught in the middle of folding laundry, almost didn't notice it. But something, perhaps the heaviness of the moment or a sense of foreboding that had settled in her chest, drew her attention to the plain, unmarked envelope now lying at her feet. She picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper in her hands. There was no return address, just her name scrawled across the front in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. For a moment, she hesitated, a strange unease creeping over her. Then, with a deep breath, she carefully opened it. The letter was short, the handwriting uneven, as if the writer had struggled with each word. Anna, by the time you read this, I may be gone. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need to say what I've carried in my heart for years. I'm sorry for everything. I was a different man then, filled with anger and fear, and I made terrible choices that hurt you and your mother. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I've lived every day since with the weight of my mistakes. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I ask that you find it in your heart to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. Carrying this burden has destroyed me, and I would not wish the same for you. Anna Clara, I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you. I see now what I was too blind to see then. If I could go back and change it all, I would. Please forgive me, if you can. Carlos Sofia read the letter once, then again, each word sinking deeper into her consciousness. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind was suddenly thrust into her life once more, bringing with it the old wounds she had thought were healing. She sat down, the letter still in her hands, her mind swirling with emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. They all vied for dominance, leaving her feeling unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Anna Clara found her like that, sitting at the kitchen table, with the letter clutched in her hand, her face pale. Sophia? What is it? Her voice was gentle, but there was a thread of concern running through it. Without a word, Sophia handed her the letter. Anna Clara took it, her eyes scanning the page. As she read, her expression tightened, and for a moment Sophia thought she saw a flicker of pain in her mother's eyes. But when Anna Clara looked up, her face was calm, though there was a weight to her gaze that hadn't been there before. He's dying, Anna Clara said quietly, setting the letter down. It wasn't a question, just a simple statement of fact. Sophia nodded, her throat tight. He's asking for forgiveness. Anna Clara was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant, as if she were looking back at a time and place Sophia couldn't see. I didn't think he'd ever ask for that, she said softly, more to herself than to Sophia. After everything. The room was filled with a heavy silence, both women lost in their own thoughts. Sophia had imagined this moment so many times, had wondered what she would say if she ever came face to face with Carlos again. But now, with the reality of it staring her in the face, all she felt was a deep, aching weariness. What do we do, Mum? Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper, the question hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Anna Clara looked at her daughter, the woman who had grown from the child she had once held so close. She saw the uncertainty in Sophia's eyes, the fear and the pain, and she knew that this decision wasn't just about Carlos. It was about them, about finding a way to finally put the past to rest. We forgive him, Anna Clara said at last, her voice firm despite the tears that threatened to spill over. Not for him, but for us. We need to let this go, Sophia. We need to find peace. Sophia nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I think you're right, she said, her voice trembling. I think it's time. They sat together for a while, holding each other's hands in the quiet of the kitchen, the letter lying between them like a bridge to a past they were ready to leave behind. When the time came, they wrote a letter back, simple and to the point. They forgave him. They wished him peace in his final days. And with that, the burden they had carried for so long began to lift, leaving behind a sense of closure, of finally being able to move forward. Carlos passed away not long after, his letter of forgiveness folded carefully in his hands. Many years had passed since Sofia and Ana Clara had first found each other again, and the quiet town where they now lived had become a place of healing and growth. Life had taken on a new rhythm, one that was filled with purpose and quiet contentment. Ana Clara's bakery, the Dolce Esperanza, had become a cornerstone of the community. The small shop, nestled on a charming street corner, was always filled with the scent of fresh bread and sweet pastries. The walls were lined with photographs and drawings from children who'd grown up coming to the bakery, and the warm, inviting space was a haven for anyone who walked through its doors. Ana Clara moved behind the counter with practiced ease, her hands kneading dough and shaping loaves as the early morning sun streamed through the windows. Every day was a new opportunity to create something beautiful, something that brought joy to others. But more than that, the bakery had become a place where women who had faced hardships could find a second chance. Ana had hired several women from difficult backgrounds, offering them not just employment, but also a sense of belonging, a community where they could rebuild their lives. Sofia, too, had found her calling. Now, a pediatrician, she spent her days caring for children with the same love and dedication that had carried her through her own journey. Her patients adored her, drawn to her warm smile and gentle manner. Sofia's deep empathy made her a natural in the field, and she often thought of her mother during quiet moments in the clinic, reflecting on the strength that had brought them both to where they were now. One afternoon, as the bakery hummed with activity, Sofia arrived after her shift, still wearing her white coat. She slipped in through the side door, the familiar scent of cinnamon and sugar instantly soothing the tension in her shoulders. Ana was at the counter, handing a box of pastries to a regular customer, her face lighting up as she saw Sofia. "You're just in time," Ana said, her eyes twinkling. "I've just finished a fresh batch of your favorite, almond cookies." Sofia smiled, leaning against the counter. "You always know how to make my day better, Mom." They moved to the small table in the corner of the shop, the one they had claimed as their own over the years. Ana poured them both cups of tea, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the bustle of the bakery around them a comforting backdrop. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," Sofia said softly, breaking the silence. She reached for one of the cookies, savoring the familiar taste. "Sometimes it feels like another lifetime." Ana nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the street. "It does," she agreed, "but I'm grateful every day for this life we've built. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." Sofia reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. The mark on her back, once a painful reminder of all they had lost, had long since transformed into a symbol of everything they had overcome. It was a part of her, just as Ana was, a reminder of the bond they shared, forged in love and resilience. As they sat there, surrounded by the fruits of their labor, the door to the bakery opened, and Marta and João, Sofia's adoptive parents, walked in. Their faces lit up at the sight of Ana and Sofia, and they quickly joined them at the table. The four of them settled into easy conversation, laughter mingling with the clink of teacups and the rustle of bakery bags. In that moment, there was a deep sense of peace that settled over them all. The struggles of the past had not been forgotten, but they had been transformed into something beautiful, into a life filled with love, purpose, and hope. As the evening drew in and the bakery began to quiet, the family remained at the table, content in the knowledge that they had come through the darkest of times together, stronger and more united than ever before. Dolce Esperanza had become more than just a bakery. It was a testament to the power of hope and the strength of the bonds that tied them together. And in that small corner of the world, Ana Clara and Sofia knew they had found their place, their home, and their future. And that, my friends, is the incredible journey of Ana Clara and Sofia, a story of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between mother and daughter. From the darkest of times to a life filled with hope and purpose, their journey reminds us all that, no matter how difficult the path, there is always a way forward if we hold on to hope. If this story touched your heart as much as it did mine, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more stories like this. Stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit and the power of love. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional journey. Until next time, keep believing in the power of hope and remember that every ending is just a new beginning waiting to unfold. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.